Today, the world is witnessing a moment it hasn't seen in nearly 4 years of war. For the first time since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, negotiators from Ukraine, Russia, and the United States are sitting at the same table, not on a battlefield, not through back-channel messages, but face-to-face in Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates. This is more than just another diplomatic meeting. This is a pivotal moment in global diplomacy, one that could reshape the course of the war in Ukraine and redefine the future of international order. For nearly 4 years, the conflict has been defined by missiles, sanctions, shifting front lines, and rising global tensions. Millions displaced, tens of thousands killed, energy markets shaken, alliances tested. And until now, direct negotiations involving all key players have been absent. So why Abu Dhabi? The United Arab Emirates has positioned itself as a neutral diplomatic, a bridge maintaining working relationships with Washington, Moscow, and Kyiv. In a world increasingly divided into rival camps, neutral ground matters more than ever. While officials remain tight-lipped about the exact agenda, sources suggest talks focus on limited ceasefire options, humanitarian corridors, prisoner exchanges, and the broader question that has haunted the war since day one. Is there any path, however narrow, toward ending this conflict without total victory or total defeat? For Ukraine, the stakes could not be higher. Kyiv enters the room determined to protect its sovereignty, its borders, and its future, while seeking stronger security guarantees from the West. For Russia, the talks offer a chance to relieve mounting economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and battlefield fatigue without appearing to retreat. And for the United States, this meeting is about more than Ukraine alone. It's about credibility, about leadership, and about whether diplomacy can still function in a world drifting toward permanent conflict. But make no mistake, no one expects a peace deal overnight. Decades of mistrust cannot be erased in a single room. The battlefield realities remain brutal, and domestic politics in all 3 countries limit how far leaders can go. Still, the symbolism matters. The mere fact that all 3 sides are present signals something important, that the cost of continuing the war may finally be outweighing the cost of compromise. History shows us that the most consequential negotiations often begin quietly, with low expectations and high skepticism. This meeting in Abu Dhabi may not end the war, but it could open a door that has been firmly shut for years. As the world watches closely, one question now dominates global headlines. One thing is certain. Today's talks remind us that peace is not forged only on the battlefield, but across tables, behind closed doors, where the future of nations is debated word by word. After nearly 4 years of intense and devastating conflict, peace negotiations surrounding the war in Ukraine have entered a new and uncertain chapter. Delegations from Ukraine, Russia, and the United States have convened in Abu Dhabi, marking what officials describe as trilateral security talks, the first meeting of its kind since the war began, for a conflict that has largely been defined by military escalation and hardened positions. Simply bringing these 3 sides into the same room is a significant development. The goal is clear, at least on paper, to end a war that has killed tens of thousands of people, displaced millions, and dramatically reshaped global geopolitics. Energy markets have been disrupted, alliances tested, and international institutions strained as the conflict dragged on far longer than many expected. Yet despite the historic nature of these talks, one crucial reality must be emphasized: no peace deal has emerged. According to multiple reports, discussions remain preliminary and cautious. Officials stress that the meetings are focused on security frameworks, humanitarian concerns, and potential confidence-building measures rather than sweeping political agreements. Issues such as prisoner exchanges, protection of civilians, and preventing further escalation are believed to be on the table. Abu Dhabi's role as host is not accidental. The United Arab Emirates has cultivated diplomatic relationships across competing global power centers, positioning itself as a neutral venue capable of facilitating dialogue where others cannot. In a world increasingly divided by rival blocs, neutral ground has become a rare and valuable asset. For Ukraine, these talks are about survival and sovereignty. Kyiv continues to insist that any resolution must respect its territorial integrity and provide lasting security guarantees. Ukrainian officials remain wary of negotiations that could freeze the conflict without addressing the root causes of the invasion. For Russia, participation offers a potential path to easing diplomatic isolation and economic pressure, while maintaining leverage on the battlefield. Moscow has signaled interest in security arrangements, but has avoided public concessions that could be seen as weakness at home. The United States, meanwhile, approaches the talks with broader strategic concerns. Beyond Ukraine, Washington is weighing the credibility of international law, the future of European security, and the message these negotiations send to allies and adversaries alike. Still, expectations remain deliberately low. History suggests that meaningful peace processes rarely begin with dramatic breakthroughs. They often start quietly, with limited agreements, deep skepticism, and long pauses between progress. The absence of a deal at this stage does not mean failure, but it does underscore how difficult the path ahead will be. One key question dominates global headlines surrounding these talks. Why Abu Dhabi? The answer lies in strategy and neutrality. The United Arab Emirates has emerged as a rare diplomatic bridge in a deeply divided world. Maintaining open channels with Washington, Moscow, and Kyiv, the UAE offers a platform removed from the political pressures of each capital. Officials describe Abu Dhabi as neutral ground, a place where dialogue can occur away from cameras, protests, and domestic political battles. According to sources familiar with the discussions, the meetings are not designed to deliver an instant peace agreement. Instead, they aim to de-escalate tensions and examine the structural issues that have kept this war alive. For nearly 4 years, military escalation, security guarantees, sanctions, and the absence of trust between adversaries. But the groundwork for these talks was laid elsewhere. Overnight negotiations in Moscow between Russian President Vladimir Putin and U.S. envoys quietly set the stage. Among those involved were Steve Witkoff, special envoy linked to former President Donald Trump, and Jared Kushner, Trump's former senior advisor. According to reports, these behind-the-scenes meetings focused on testing whether limited diplomatic openings still exist between the world's two most powerful rivals. The outcome? Enough momentum to move discussions to neutral territory, but not enough to bridge the deepest divide of the war. Because while talks continue, Russia is holding firm on its core demand. Moscow insists that Ukraine must relinquish territory as a prerequisite for peace. This position remains non-negotiable, according to Russian officials, and represents the single greatest obstacle to any breakthrough. For Ukraine, this demand is unacceptable. Kyiv argues that surrendering territory would reward aggression, undermine international law, and leave the country vulnerable to future attacks. Ukrainian leaders maintain that peace cannot come at the cost of sovereignty. The United States finds itself navigating a delicate balance, supporting Ukraine's position while exploring whether limited agreements could reduce civilian suffering and prevent wider escalation. American officials stress that dialogue does not mean concession, but acknowledge that wars of this scale rarely end without painful compromises. This is why expectations remain cautious. The talks in Abu Dhabi are not about final borders or victory declarations. They are about whether diplomacy still has a role in a conflict increasingly defined by exhaustion, economic strain, and global instability. History offers a sobering lesson. Wars often end not when one side wins completely, but when all sides conclude the cost of continuing is greater than the cost of talking. For now, that calculation has not fully shifted. Russia is not retreating from its demands. Ukraine is not surrendering its land, and the United States is not abandoning its principles. This is the heart of the deadlock, the single issue that continues to block any real path to peace. Russian President Vladimir Putin insists that territorial concessions are essential for any long-term settlement to the war in Ukraine. At the center of that demand lies the eastern Donbas region, an area that has been fought over relentlessly since the earliest days of the conflict. From Moscow's perspective, Donbas is not just land, it is history, influence, and security. Russian officials argue that parts of Donetsk and Luhansk are historically linked to Russia's sphere of influence, and claim the region holds strategic and cultural importance. In practical terms, Russia wants Ukraine to withdraw its forces and formally cede control of these territories. For the Kremlin, this demand is framed as a prerequisite for stability. Russian leaders argue that without territorial adjustments, any ceasefire would only delay the next phase of war. Ukraine, however, sees the issue in completely different terms. President Volodymyr Zelensky has repeatedly and unequivocally rejected any proposal that involves surrendering sovereign territory. For Kyiv, ceding land would do more than redraw a map. It would legitimize invasion, reward military aggression, and weaken the foundations of international law. Ukrainian officials warn that giving up Donbas would set a dangerous precedent, signaling to the world that borders can be changed by force. In their view, peace built on territorial loss would be fragile, temporary, and ultimately invite further conflict. This clash of principles is why negotiations remain stalled. On one side, Russia believes territorial control is the key to ending the war. On the other, Ukraine believes territorial integrity is non-negotiable. Both positions are deeply entrenched, shaped by national identity, domestic politics, and the human cost already paid on the battlefield. Even international mediators privately acknowledge that this is the final and most difficult hurdle. Humanitarian corridors, prisoner exchanges, and de-escalation measures may be achievable. But borders, especially borders written in blood, are far harder to compromise. The United States and European allies continue to support Ukraine's position, emphasizing that peace cannot come through coercion. At the same time, Western diplomats recognize that most wars ultimately end with uncomfortable negotiations, not total victories. That tension defines the moment. This is no longer just a military standoff. It is a test of whether diplomacy can reconcile two irreconcilable visions of peace. One vision demands land in exchange for silence. The other demands justice in exchange for peace. Until that contradiction is resolved, the war remains locked in place, not because talks are impossible, but because the price of compromise is one that neither side is willing to pay. And that is why, despite dialogue and diplomacy, the guns have not yet fallen silent. To understand where these negotiations could lead, it's important to look closely at who is actually sitting at the table and who is not. On the Ukrainian side, the delegation is led by senior figures, including Rustem Umerov and top national security officials. Their mission is clear and uncompromising: protect Ukraine's sovereignty. Kyiv's negotiators have been instructed not to concede territory under any circumstances, unless accompanied by ironclad, long-term security guarantees. For Ukraine, talks are not about ending the war at any cost. They are about ensuring the war cannot happen again. Representing Russia, the delegation includes high-ranking military and intelligence figures such as Admiral Igor Kostyukov. Moscow's presence signals that these talks are being treated as a security and strategic negotiation, not merely a diplomatic exercise. Russia continues to apply pressure on territorial terms, reinforcing the Kremlin's long-standing position that control over disputed regions is central to any settlement. The United States occupies a unique and influential role. The American delegation reflects the foreign policy approach shaped by Donald Trump's political circle, with envoys including Steve Witkoff and former senior advisor Jared Kushner. The task is arguably the most complex, bridging a divide where both sides believe compromise threatens their core national interests. Washington is pushing for diplomatic solutions, while also seeking credible security guarantees, not only for Ukraine, but for regional stability as a whole. U.S. officials frame the talks as an attempt to prevent escalation and open pathways toward a controlled, enforceable peace. What makes these negotiations especially unusual is who is missing. Historically, major peace efforts involving Europe have included Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and EU institutions. Yet in Abu Dhabi, European allies are noticeably absent from the core negotiations. Their exclusion has raised eyebrows across diplomatic circles. Some analysts describe the talks as a US-led peace initiative, driven by Washington's desire to manage the conflict directly, rather than through multilateral European frameworks. Others see something more concerning: a growing divergence between US strategic direction and Europe's willingness to intervene more assertively. European leaders remain publicly supportive of Ukraine, but privately, questions are mounting over whether Europe is being sidelined or choosing to step back at a decisive moment. This shift reflects a broader change in global diplomacy. Power is increasingly concentrated in smaller negotiating formats, where speed and influence outweigh consensus. Abu Dhabi's talks may represent not just a new phase in the Ukraine war, but a new model for how major conflicts are managed. As negotiations continue, the composition of the room itself tells a story, one of power, priorities, and changing alliances. Who speaks? Who decides? This is not just a territorial dispute. It is the human cost of nearly 4 years of relentless warfare. Across Ukraine, the scars of war are impossible to ignore. Entire cities have been reduced to rubble. Power stations and water systems have been repeatedly targeted. During brutal winter months, millions of civilians were left without heat, struggling to survive as temperatures plunged below freezing. For ordinary Ukrainians, the war is not measured in maps or negotiations. It is measured in blackouts, air raid sirens, and lives upended. Ukraine desperately needs peace talks to succeed. Its civilian infrastructure remains under constant attack. The economy has been drained by years of military spending and lost productivity. Families have been separated, communities displaced, and after years of uncertainty, exhaustion has set in, not just on the battlefield, but in homes, hospitals, and shelters across the country. For Kyiv, diplomacy is no longer an abstract option. It is a necessity for survival. Russia, too, has paid a heavy price. The war has brought crippling international sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and significant military losses. Russia's economy has been reshaped under pressure, and its global standing fundamentally altered. Yet despite these costs, the Kremlin continues to pursue its military objectives, even as officials speak publicly about peace and negotiation. This contradiction defines Moscow's approach, talking diplomacy while maintaining pressure through force. For the United States and its allies, what happens next goes far beyond Ukraine. A resolution to this conflict could redefine global power dynamics, test the credibility of U.S. diplomacy, and set precedents for how future wars are handled. If diplomacy succeeds, it could reinforce the idea that international disputes can still be resolved through negotiation. If it fails, it may signal a world where prolonged conflict becomes the norm, not the exception. This is why the stakes feel so high. The outcome of these talks will influence how nations assess risk, aggression, and restraint in the years ahead. From Eastern Europe to the Indo-Pacific, governments are watching closely, measuring what this war says about deterrence, alliances, and the limits of power. At its core, this moment is about choices. Whether leaders choose compromise over escalation, whether diplomacy can outpace destruction, and whether the suffering of millions can finally give way to a fragile but lasting peace. The war in Ukraine has already reshaped the world in profound ways. The question now is whether the effort to end it will reshape the future, or become another missed opportunity buried beneath the weight of history. For Ukraine, the urgency is personal. For Russia, the consequences are strategic. For the world, the implications are global. And that is why these negotiations matter, not just for one region, but for the future of international order itself. Former US President Donald Trump remains a central and controversial figure in the ongoing efforts to bring the war in Ukraine to an end. Although he is no longer in office, Trump has played an active role behind the scenes, shaping peace initiatives and influencing the diplomatic direction of current negotiations. His involvement reflects a broader belief held by his supporters that unconventional diplomacy may succeed where traditional approaches have failed. Trump has openly discussed territorial elements in past conversations with Russian President Vladimir Putin, including controversial ideas such as territorial swaps as a means to end hostilities. While no formal proposals have been confirmed, the mere acknowledgement of such discussions has sparked intense debate among diplomats and analysts. To critics, these ideas risk legitimizing territorial conquest by force. To supporters, they represent pragmatic thinking, an attempt to end a war that has dragged on for years with devastating consequences. Adding to the controversy is Trump's introduction of a new diplomatic initiative known as the Board of Peace. The body is intended to reshape how international conflicts are resolved, moving away from large multilateral institutions towards smaller, more direct negotiation frameworks. Notably, Trump has even invited Russia to participate in this initiative. Supporters argue that this approach reflects geopolitical reality. They claim that excluding major powers from peace mechanisms only prolongs conflicts, and that direct U.S. engagement with adversaries is often the only way to achieve meaningful breakthroughs. From this perspective, talking to Moscow is not endorsement, it is necessity. Critics, however, see significant risks. They warn that involving Russia in a US-led peace framework could grant Moscow disproportionate leverage, allowing it to extract concessions without making meaningful compromises. Others fear that sidelining traditional allies and institutions could weaken international norms and undermine collective security. This debate highlights a deeper divide over how modern diplomacy should function. Should peace be pursued through established alliances and international law, even if progress is slow, or through direct high-stakes engagement between powerful leaders, even if that means bending long-standing rules? Trump's approach challenges decades of diplomatic convention, emphasizing deal-making over consensus and speed over process. It is a style that has produced mixed results in the past, praised by supporters for its boldness and criticized by opponents for its unpredictability. As negotiations continue, Trump's influence remains undeniable. Whether through formal envoys, private discussions, or public statements, his ideas continue to shape the conversation around what peace might look like and what compromises might be required. Diplomats involved in the Abu Dhabi meetings describe them as a potential turning point, but not a guaranteed breakthrough. Both Kyiv and Moscow arrive with sharply competing visions of what peace actually means. For Ukraine, peace means security, sovereignty, and borders that cannot be changed by force. For Russia, peace appears tied to territorial control and long-term influence. Those opposing definitions sit at the core of why this war has been so difficult to resolve. Some observers warn that these negotiations could lead to something short of true peace, a frozen conflict. In that scenario, the fighting slows or stops, but the underlying issues remain unresolved. Ukraine could be left in a permanent state of insecurity, vulnerable to renewed aggression, while the world moves on without addressing the root causes of the war. History offers plenty of examples where frozen conflicts created decades of instability rather than lasting solutions. Others, however, see cautious reason for optimism. Supporters of the talks argue that creative compromises may still be possible. Ideas such as international security guarantees, phased agreements, or monitored ceasefires could offer a pathway forward, not perfect, but workable. These approaches would aim to stop the violence first, then address deeper political disputes over time. The challenge is trust, or rather the absence of it. Years of warfare, broken agreements, and mutual suspicion have made compromise politically dangerous for leaders on all sides. Every concession risks backlash at home. Every pause in fighting risks being interpreted as weakness. That is why expectations remain deliberately low. And yet, one fact cannot be ignored. The mere existence of these talks is historic. For the first time since the war began, Ukraine, Russia, and the United States are sitting at the same table, engaging directly on the future of the conflict. That alone represents a shift from total confrontation toward cautious dialogue. So what happens next? Abu Dhabi is not the finish line. It is the opening move in what is likely to be an intense and prolonged diplomatic push, one that could determine the fate of Europe's largest land war since World War II. The road ahead will be slow, fragile, and filled with setbacks. Progress, if it comes, will likely arrive in small steps rather than dramatic announcements. But the alternative, endless war, is one the world can no longer afford. The central question now is stark. Will these talks finally bring an end to years of bloodshed? Or will unresolved territorial disputes doom the effort before it truly begins? As negotiations continue behind closed doors, the world is watching closely, because the outcome will shape not only Ukraine's future, but the global order for years to come. This story is far from over. For continuing coverage of the Russia-Ukraine war, peace negotiations, and the geopolitics shaping our world, subscribe and hit the bell icon.